I guess the first thing I want to say is I hope this will be more of a discussion than me a presentation. I have looked over the smart home, mainstream smart home technologies, your tech transfer plan so far, and you've thought about a lot of issues related to what the revenue model, how to build a community around your technology, about the interviews and the paper that you have published on the need for this delivery tools, services to engage, to help the providers of these wireless smart home technologies to deliver them in a way that is effective for people with disabilities and also with elderly people who have some similar needs. So my objective for today is to talk about two things that I think are connected with the stage that you're currently trying to flesh out now, how to get paid and how to engage stakeholders. And those two things are clearly related. Which stakeholders are going to pay you? There are a variety of different revenue models and pricing strategies. And so I want to share some general approaches to thinking about what might be the revenue model for this, for the technologies, as well as the tools that you're developing to help deliver assistive technologies for smart homes. I'll introduce, secondly, some concepts related to social networking that are, I think, relevant for how to engage stakeholders. Will complement some of the things that you've done through the Impact Center with engaging customers and user communities. And then also I have some examples throughout, and I'm hoping at each point where I talk about an example, we can sort of step back and say, what are some implications, possible new ideas related to delivering smart home assistive technologies. So in order for any new venture to be sustainable, obviously there has to be some mode of getting paid. If you're going to be involved in continuing to build out the tools, you need to fund people to do that, unless you're considering building an open source community, and that being part of a translational research process where there isn't a monetary flow. But my understanding is that part of the model for sustaining what you're doing is to find a revenue model. And as you all know, we've moved a long way from inventor or company builds device, hands it over to a user gives money back. Revenue models have there are a lot of options. And so one of the things that helps to work your way through which options are the best fit for my venture are to ask some important questions. One is to think about, how do you create value? Often we think about value coming from the core functionality of a device or from what job your services and your tools are enabling your end user to get done better. But you talk about in your tech transfer plan playing a brokering role. How you create value can also primarily come from the role that you're playing in an ecosystem of users and payers and other developers, not just from the problem that you solve. And a lot of the startups that I've worked with, how they've ultimately gotten paid had a lot less to do with the device or the tool or the software that they created, and had a lot more to do with the role that they were playing in an ecosystem of developers and users and payers. And then for whom? Often we create new things with the patient or the end user in mind, but what you can monetize, which value you can actually attach some payment system to, is not necessarily that end user. So we can pay for things like better patient outcomes, costs avoided in hospitals, et cetera. But who is in a position to pay you for some of the value that create depends a lot on the specific nature of the ecosystem that you're introducing your innovation into. So as I've already said, what can you monetize goes way beyond the core function of your service or your technology. And a question I think in healthcare, we're probably more in the habit of asking than in other contexts, but since this technology isn't necessarily going to be a reimbursed service, I think it's worth still asking this question, whether when you've determined these are all the ways that we create value in this ecosystem, these are all the organizations, types of users, and partners that could benefit from what we're doing. And so we have these opportunities to monetize what we're offering. Then you want to ask, is there already a system for paying for that value in place for any of those stakeholders? One of the things that is, I think that I see when I work with early stage startups, first time inventors trying to take something to the market, is often figuring out what the revenue model is. So what you're monetizing, and then your pricing strategy is a stage that comes after really nailing your value proposition and your target customer segments. And I think our examples will illustrate, and I think it's often the case that it's something you want to think about in parallel. So as you're working through who's the end user, who are the other customers, who else are you adding value to, you're thinking about, so what can I monetize and how should I charge for that value that I'm providing to that particular stakeholder? At the same time, you're still perfecting your value proposition and still thinking about how do I segment customers or other stakeholders, because even though it sounds like you're just putting a number on what you're offering, the pricing strategy that you use actually has a lot of implications for other aspects of the business model that you develop. So I have a couple of local examples. StatEasy is not a healthcare startup, and they don't exist any longer, but for a while, they had a bright future. This was a technology that was, the inventor saw a way to try to help coaches improve their teams. So it was a way to annotate videos and to be able to track improvement over time. So you can imagine contexts where a physical therapist might want something similar, or speech therapist might want something similar, where you have a video record and you have data connected to that video, and you have coding connected to those specific moves in the video. So the technology worked great. Users, coaches that were involved in helping to perfect the design provided really positive testimonials. But when it came time to getting paid, StatEasy ran into a lot of trouble. The pro sports teams already have sophisticated video technologies. Colleges have pretty good approaches. So they settled on high schools and middle schools, but it's a market where who pays for the innovations, technologies, services that help to support their sports teams varies a lot by geography, private school, public school. So they could not find a big enough group of users, the coaches that were benefiting and the players that were benefiting, to pay for the technology. But what they discovered along the way is that they were actually solving a different problem, or an additional problem. They were, parents saw these videos of their kids, who were, many of whom were seeking to get into college with a sports scholarship or wanted to play on a sports team, as something that was a value added to send in with their college application. So now they have to think about, how do we build relationships with these parents? How do we, capture some of the videos in a way that it's suitable for that additional source of value? So what they could ultimately get paid for wasn't for solving the problem they initially set out to solve, but they did find another revenue source, and at least had the opportunity to continue to take the business forward. So I break getting paid into two different categories of considerations. One is the revenue model, and by revenue model we mean how are customers going to pay and what are they paying for? And I'm sure these are all familiar options to you. You can pay to own something, you can pay to use something for a while, you can pay to use something on an hourly basis, you pay for business support services, or you pay for access to data. And there's strategy behind how you choose an appropriate revenue model. But it's, but it's different from your pricing strategy. So we'll talk about pricing strategies separately. This is just thinking again about what are all the ways I create value for not just the end user, but all the other stakeholders in the ecosystem that I am going to depend on to get my service, my technology to the end user, and continue to improve it and develop it over time. And this is just to point out the opportunity to think about what are customers going to pay for and what can I monetize starts all the way at customers become aware of you. So that whole chain of consumption or customer awareness, in addition to how do they make decisions? Do you do something? Do you provide information that makes it easier for them to choose among the alternatives? Is there service that you provide pre-sales that they would value? Those are all places where you can potentially add value and capture value. So pricing strategies are a little different. Pricing strategies is the logic that drives how much you charge. So for that thing that you monetize, whether it's the data, the service, a role like brokering, it's okay, then how do you come to the amount you're going to attach to creating value in that way? And prices can be fixed, they can be dynamic, or they can be some combination of both. And again, we just have more and more options in terms of configuring a pricing mechanism that fits with all of the unique opportunities and constraints and different kinds of ecosystems, and make use of data. Data about what's driving demand, data about what outcomes you're enabling for your customers or other stakeholders. So dynamic prices will be connected to something that is often it's observable data, but how much you're pricing for that outcome is changing over time. So going up if there's more demand. Whereas for a fixed price, the price might change over time, but it's tied in a fixed way to something that's an observable outcome. So the cost of something, for example. And then there are free calculators for all of these different strategies, and there are different reasons to use one strategy versus another. So when we start just generally talking about, is this a viable business, we tend to start with a value-based approach. What is your customer or the paying stakeholder going to be willing to pay? And a starting assumption is you want to charge them as close to that willingness to pay as possible. That's the place where you would capture as much of the value that you're creating as your customer is willing to part with. But there are lots of variations, and depending on the market and depending on the type of business, different pricing strategies make sense. So cost plus pricing tends to be a good model for devices. How much did it cost to produce and deliver it, plus some margin that you want to be able to maintain that is maybe a competitive margin for the market that you're in, or it's a margin that will allow you to hire the kinds of talent that you need to keep the business going, all the way down to project-based. And project-based is an interesting pricing strategy, particularly early. So when you're at the point where you're trying to build relationships with stakeholders, you might think about, this is an outcome that is an opportunity for us to prove the value of what we're offering. And so it may be a one-time fee. It may be a fee that's contingent on your partners or your customers' evaluation of the outcome. And often I think geography-based pricing is important for early stage companies, because on the one hand, it gives you an opportunity to understand better what the market might bear. There are a lot of differences across the country in access to solutions. There may be different available partners. So if you were, for example, offering assessment tools and installation services as a complement to voice recognition home technologies, and you're in upstate New York and there aren't a lot of companies around, then you may be partnering with somebody who's a small startup also, or you might be partnering with somebody that can effectively deliver your services online, like Apple. And my parents are in upstate New York. They have a lot of technology challenges. So reading your tech transfer plan and what you're offering, I could immediately connect with the things that they really struggle with as people who are elderly, have trouble with simple things like, where do I get to my voice activated command on my remote control? And Apple's been a great source of tech support for their phone and their computer, but the physical devices are hard for them to support over the phone. All right, so I wanted to just stop and this is my last local Pittsburgh example, but some of you might know Force Devices. So this is a startup. They were recently declared, or last year, their technology was declared a breakthrough technology. So they've had a lot of technical success, but like StatEasy, they've had some challenges trying to figure out how to get paid. So their device is a stroke detection device that works very accurately, and it works as soon as the potential, or as soon as there's some signs that somebody may have had a stroke. The founder is the EMT who was very cognizant of the fact that existing stroke detection mechanisms were subjective, so this provided an objective means of determining whether somebody actually had a stroke. So I'm taking volunteers here. What seems to be the best way for Forest Devices to get paid for this device that they've created? What revenue model might they choose? So what should they monetize? No wild guesses? Well, back to our Nancy.
I see a couple of different ways to create value. Ultimately, the beneficiary is the client who survives the trip to the hospital. But I realize that the users are the EMTs who are using it as an interventional device to make sure that client makes it to the hospital.
Yeah. So again, it's much easier to connect the patient value. But in this case, it was really hard to figure out how to get compensation. Ambulances get compensated for the services provided, but they have very thin margins. Most are publicly owned, some are hospital owned, and those are used for transfers. Ultimately, the value added to the patient was better treatment. And to get better treatment, not only did they need as quick as possible diagnosis of whether a stroke had occurred and what kind of stroke, but they needed to get to the right hospital because most hospitals don't treat stroke, and there are different classes of strokes that are treated by different hospitals. So they were enabling the ambulance to go to the right place and to interface with the right hospital. They were not able to come up with a feasible revenue model or pricing strategy for the ambulances, but they did discover that hospitals were very excited about this, because if they can treat stroke patients appropriately, they get more stroke patients coming to them that they can actually treat. Then they avoid lost reimbursement for getting the patients they can't treat, and then the not just bad outcomes for patient, but inefficiency in the hospital of getting them to the right place. So it had an effect on their ability to treat patients better, get reimbursed more, because they could apply the right DRG. And so what did Force Devices find to actually monetize were the consumables. So they have sticky electrodes that you can put on through your hair in an ambulance really quickly. So this, it's 7 years now that they've been around. It took a few years of actually working through these questions. Who are they creating value for? And patient, of course, not so much the ambulance, but more so the hospitals. And then figuring out that they could use a razor blade model in this case. There are other discoveries along the way, like which insurers are bearing most of the charge, but ultimately they found they've been successful with a different revenue model than the one they initially started with. So each of these pricing strategies and revenue models can be used to different degrees, can be used in combination with one another. Usage-based pricing is something that is growing in popularity with software as a service ventures. And I think in part it's because it's much lower risk, right? To only be charged for what you're using. You can combine that with some sort of initial fee that goes along with installation. But there are a lot of interesting examples of software as service companies that are using usage-based pricing. And this is just reminding us that whatever pricing strategy and revenue model you choose, it has implications for the time over which and how you're building your relationships with your customers. It can impact your marketing strategy, can certainly impact the cash flows that are coming into your business. And so again, I just want to reiterate, it's important to already be thinking about revenue models and pricing strategies. Right, so the other topic I was going to touch on is engaging stakeholders. And here I wanted to bring in this perspective from social networks. Probably can't see that, but Damon Santola has done a lot of really great work, and quite a lot of it in the medical field. He and his collaborators have conducted experiments creating online platforms that allow them to study how social networks affect changes in behaviors, whether that's adopting an innovation, a new practice, or whether it's engaging in different lifestyle behaviors that affect health. They've been able to determine a lot about what they call the network topology. So it's what this looks like. These are potential adopters. So if you're introducing this a set of services and tools to assist in the installation and use of smart home technologies for people with disabilities, which blue dots are you going to target to try to build engagement around that early on? So before your innovation is proven to lead to higher quality of life and more independence. If you think it's the left blue dot, the centrally connected blue dot, maybe just put some reaction on your screen. Any reaction? One nodded head. This is the, for decades, dominant model, right? We find a key influencer, an opinion leader. Could be a very experienced doctor. It could be a company that's out on the forefront of introducing new technology and new practices in a particular domain. And it's much more efficient, right? We just have to persuade one actor who's going to go build trust and help to provide us with credibility by making the case for our innovation. What Santola's work shows is actually this is a place where innovations sometimes go to die if it's an innovation where there's a lot of uncertainty around the benefits that it can provide, if there is complexity in making it work. So if it's innovation that requires multiple different kinds of stakeholders supporting it, that's riskier. If there's some way in which it conflicts with social norms or business norms, then all of those things that make adoption an uncertain, risky prospect for your end user or other stakeholders means if this is your target, they're often not going to do what you would like them to do and help to diffuse it because they're connected to all of these other actors. And early on, most of those are non-adopters. So his research shows this can actually put you in a position of, depending on an actor that has a lot of countervailing influences, naysayers. And the difference with this structure is you have a densely connected cluster. You have two early adopters. So these might be people that you've worked with. It might be an organization that you've trained. And the advantage that they have is anybody like this actor right here is connected to two prior adopters. So there's some social reinforcement in this structure. that if I'm a potential partner for you, or I'm a potential user or payer, if there's two members of our ecosystem or two other potential end users who have experience with the technology, I'm going to start to become more comfortable with it more quickly. And they have each other for reinforcement. So we've seen in the diffusion literature, the shift from, just put it on television, get your message out there, people will hear it and they'll adopt, to no, most of it falls on deaf ears. We have to find somebody who's really engaged with the subject and will go explain it to others and make others aware of it, to what we need for technologies or innovations where there's uncertainty with respect to the benefits, where we need to coordinate with others, are to build these wide bridges. So a wide bridge is just, you want as many of your prospective adopters to be exposed to multiple prior adopters as possible. And that means you're looking for tightly connected communities. It could be a user group, and you want more than one person in there to be on board with what you're offering. So the other point, all of his articles and books are about changing behavior, right? So it's much riskier than deciding which song you're going to listen to, which movie you're going to go to, or which simple practice you might adopt. So the need to build wide bridges is when there's uncertainty, there's risk. Wide bridges provide social reinforcement. In social network terms, it means you're looking for places where there's redundancy, there are overlapping social ties amongst the actors you want to get on board, as opposed to if it's just simple. If I know about it, obviously the benefits are going to be clear to me. Then you want social network ties that reach across different clusters. Oftentimes, we can expect that for a new technology that requires a change in behavior, goes against norms, requires coordination among an ecosystem of actors, we're going to start over here. So we're going to have to build support through these redundant ties, but we'll eventually get to where we can just find those key influencers. You want a safe place early on to incubate an innovation. And these are some suggestions that put the network structure into a actionable item. So you want to avoid those centrally connected potential adopters or supporters early on, because they're subject to so many countervailing influences. You want to look for clusters that are more at the periphery, so who might be supportive, and they're not going to be subject to all the naysayers early on. So you have time to build some proof, build some support. You're looking to equip multiple early adopters, so multiple change agents in densely connected clusters. And then there's this last piece, which is who those change agents are, who you're trying to get on board early, depends on what the barrier is. So if it's about social norms, this isn't how we do things, right? This conflicts with how I'm used to conducting myself in my house, or who I'm used to working with, or technology. You might need similar others as adopters. So if you have the same impairment that I have, or we have the same experience as older people with technology, getting exposed to more adopters like me will build support quicker. If it's a coordination issue, or this technology, this innovation is just so new, it doesn't have legitimacy yet, people see it as, well, maybe, right? It might stick around, it might get support. Then having change agents that come from different part of the ecosystem early on can be a more effective way to build, to provide that social reinforcement that will build support for the innovation early on. And then the last slide is just another thought on engaging stakeholders. And this is my colleague Sharon Alvarez, who looks at entrepreneurship and focuses on the case where it's never an incremental thing. Like in most of the technologies we work with, there's something potentially disruptive, it's early stage. There's, in some important ways, it's not like what's out there in a market. And so as you're engaging these change agents, as you're looking for clustered peripheral communities to try to build support, some of what's going on is you're trying to build identification with the purpose of that venture. So you will already know some of those ecosystem actors that are going to easily identify with what you're trying to accomplish. And that's because you want your stakeholders to be clear about, well, what's my stake in it? And then as you're bringing them together in an active way, so this could be in a workshop, it could be in an online community, but you're creating language around your shared stakes in it. There's literature that talks about this as common ground. It's why are we all here? So it might not be, it's probably overlapping with what my stake is in it, but it's a little bit different. And once we have a shared language to talk about what our collective stake is, then you have some emotional connection to what the collective goal is. And you already have, and you also have some language, which is important for helping to make it a reality. Examples that I've seen of this are bringing people together early on to work with the technology to help build out the tools, to test it. In some of Centola's work, it's online forums around changing healthcare behaviors. And again, there's a lot of communication between the stakeholders that you're trying to build support in. So that's the end of my slides. As usual, I thought we'd have 5 minutes of discussion for each slide, and that was impossible. But hopefully the difference between revenue model, pricing strategy, thinking about these social network mechanisms are concepts that you can fold into, building out how do you get paid? How do you build a supportive, sustainable community around what you're doing? And if there's any piece of that you want to dive into and some more specifics, I'm happy to have another conversation or go dig some more wireless smart home technology specific examples up. All right.